My husband Harold always sat at the head of the table, not because he insisted on it, but because we all quietly agreed that's where he belonged. Every evening, like clockwork, he would clear his throat before reaching for the pepper grinder, then glance at me and say, "Let's eat, darling." It was a small ritual, unremarkable to anyone else, but it stitched the seams of our family life together for over 40 years. Now the chair is empty. It has been for nearly 6 years. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you are watching from. I still set the table for 3 when no one is looking. Old habits die harder than grief. Harold's chair, a sturdy oak-backed thing with arms rubbed smooth from his restless fingers, remains untouched in my memory, even if, in Rachel's new house, it now sits somewhere in the garage under a pile of yoga mats and outgrown toys. That chair is where the silence in my life began, and where, in many ways, the story I'm about to tell you truly starts. When Harold passed, I shrank. There's no other word for it. My days, once filled with purpose, registrar at Northfield High, wife, home-cooked dinners, track meets, Sunday morning pancakes, suddenly became voids to be filled. I thought the weight of widowhood would be a constant ache, but instead, it was the weightlessness that terrified me. I floated through the days, no longer needed, no longer tethered, until Rachel said the words that snapped me back to earth. "Mom, this house is too big for you. Why don't you come live with us in Burlington?" She said it like a gift, as if she had carefully wrapped an opportunity in tissue paper and was holding it out to me with a bow. Rachel had always been my golden girl straight A student, piano recitals, debate team, class president. She was our only child, the focus of our world. And now she had a family of her own, her husband Scott, and 2 beautiful children, Ben and Lily. I told myself this invitation was love, that she needed me, that I would matter again. I sold our old house, the one Harold and I bought in 1973, the one where we brought Rachel home from the hospital, where we planted hydrangeas out front and patched the roof ourselves one rainy summer. I sold it in a fog, the real estate agent speaking in numbers I barely absorbed. I signed the papers with a hand that trembled, thinking not of profit, but of finality. The money went straight to Rachel's new place, a sprawling craftsman-style home on a quiet street, 5 minutes from a well-rated elementary school and 2 blocks from a yoga studio she liked. My contribution paid the down payment and most of the closing costs. In return, they built me a private suite above the detached garage. 1 room, a small kitchenette, and a bathroom. It was efficient, like a hotel. They called it cozy. I told myself it was enough. The first few months were filled with grateful smiles and endless thank yous. Rachel hugged me every morning before heading off to Pilates. Scott made me coffee, just how Harold used to, too weak, but thoughtful. I felt useful again. I picked up the kids from school, packed their lunches, cleaned the house while they worked. Rachel would return in the evenings flushed from her spin class, kiss the top of my head, and say, "You're a lifesaver, Mom." And I'd nod, because that's what mothers do. They nod, they smile, they say, "Of course." I didn't notice it at first, how the thank yous got quieter, how the requests started piling up. Small things at first, folding laundry, grocery runs, sitting with Lily during her nap. But the small things turned into expected things. My presence became part of the architecture of their household, reliable, silent, taken for granted. One day, I heard Rachel refer to the suite as Mom's little wing, followed by a laugh and, "It's great having built-in childcare." The words weren't meant to hurt, but they did. Built in, like a coffee maker, like central air. Still, I told myself it was okay, that this was the trade-off for belonging, that it was a privilege to be needed. Until one evening, I came in from folding towels to find Harold's old armchair. Yes, the same one that used to be at the head of our dinner table, shoved into a corner of the garage beneath a stack of Scott's golf clubs. I ran my hand over the cracked leather where Harold's elbow used to rest. I could almost feel the warmth of him there, a ghost memory stubborn in its refusal to fade. That's when I realized it wasn't just the furniture being repurposed, it was me. They had made space for me in their lives, but not as a mother, not as a person with stories, or grief, or needs of her own. I was a convenience, a fixture. The perfect grandmother in the background of their curated lives. And the chair, the one that used to anchor our family dinners, the one that Harold died believing would always belong to us, now sat discarded, dusty, forgotten, much like me, but I wasn't ready to believe that yet. Not entirely. So I swept their floors, I made their pancakes, I folded the same towels I had taught Rachel to fold when she was 10 years old. I wore the smile they needed to see, and I pretended that the ache in my chest was something else, something easier than loneliness, something easier than betrayal. There's a strange sort of comfort in routine, even when the routine is quietly bleeding you dry. Each morning, before the sun touched the tops of the sugar maples outside, I'd be up. The floorboards of my little suite creaked as I moved through the motions: oatmeal on the stove, blueberries rinsed, pancake batter whisked to the consistency Rachel preferred when she was a child. I still used the old pan Harold and I bought on our honeymoon in Maine. Its handle was cracked, but I couldn't bring myself to replace it. It was the only thing in that kitchen that truly belonged to me. Ben would always be the first one down, still in his dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from his eyes. "Is it pancake day, Grandma?" he'd whisper, and I'd smile, handing him a warm plate. Lily came next, trailing a blanket behind her, already asking if she could wear her glitter shoes to school. Rachel would float in last, fresh from the shower, yoga mat slung over her shoulder like a badge of suburban honor. "God, you're amazing," she'd say, barely glancing at me as she reached for her matcha smoothie. "I don't know what we'd do without you." Then came the touch on my arm, always the same. "Hey, do you think I could borrow a little cash? I forgot my wallet upstairs and I'm meeting Katie and them after class." The first time, I didn't think twice. I pulled a 20 from my purse and told her to have fun. The second time, I gave her 40. By the fifth time, she didn't bother to ask if it was okay, just said, "You're the best," as the bill disappeared into her handbag. At first, I told myself it was harmless, a mother helping her daughter. What else was I going to do with my pension? It's not like I was taking cruises or buying handbags. But as the requests grew more frequent: gas money, groceries, just until payday, I started to notice the pattern. My generosity had become expected, built into the rhythm of their lives. And then came the credit card. Rachel had been having a hard time, she said. There were unexpected school fees, the kids' dentist appointments, an emergency vet bill. "It's just for those moments when things come up," she said, eyes wide and earnest. "You'd be doing me such a favor, Mom." So I opened a supplementary card in her name. I even gave her the PIN, telling myself I was being supportive, that I trusted her. That's what mothers do, right? We trust. She promised to only use it for emergencies, for things that really mattered. That first month, the charges were manageable: pharmacy, gas, school supplies. But then came Lululemon, Sephora, a $300 charge at a spa that offered Himalayan salt scrubs and champagne facials. When I gently asked about it, she waved me off with a bright laugh. "Oh, that's reimbursable through Scott's company. I just needed to put it somewhere quick. Don't worry, Mom, I've got it all under control." But of course, it was never paid back, and I didn't press. Because every time I opened my mouth to protest, I saw Rachel as she once was, 6 years old, running home from school with skinned knees and a painting clutched in her hands, crying because a classmate said it was ugly. I remember kneeling down and telling her, "No one who truly sees you will ever think you're anything less than brilliant." Now I wonder if she learned that lesson too well. The suite above the garage had once been my haven. Small, yes, but tidy, quiet, mine. I had arranged my books just so, framed a few old black and white photos of Harold and me hiking in Acadia, placed a worn quilt over the arm of my reading chair. But over time, things started to appear that didn't belong to me. First, a stack of moving boxes labeled holiday decorations. Then Scott's old guitar amp. Then a Peloton, still in its box, wedged into the corner where I used to stretch each morning in the patch of sunlight that filtered through the east window. I came home from the grocery store one day, arms full, only to find the yoga mat and foam rollers tucked beside my bookshelf. "Just until we reorganize," Rachel chirped, breezing in behind me. "We're thinking of converting the basement into a gym, But in the meantime, this is the only space. She didn't ask. She didn't offer to move anything. She just assumed. That was the real shift, not the clutter itself, but the presumption that my space was theirs to manage. I didn't argue. I never did. I smiled, nodded, made room. Because that's what I had become, a shapeshifter, adapting to the needs of others, shrinking myself until I was barely a presence at all. It was around this time that my friend Margot started calling more often. She and I had worked together at the high school for over 2 decades. She had retired to Florida and spent her mornings walking on the beach with her spaniel and her evenings doing crosswords in pen. During one of our phone calls, as I sat on the edge of my bed balancing a stack of utility bills I hadn't incurred, I finally confessed what was happening. "Rachel's just having a hard time," I said, trying to sound breezy. "Evelyn," Margot said, her voice as firm as it had been when we used to chase down missing transcripts, "you're not a wallet, you're not a maid, you are not a second-class citizen in your own family." I laughed, trying to deflect. "She's just overwhelmed. The kids are a lot. And you're 72, Margot snapped. "You raised your kid. You don't owe her your pension, your dignity, or your square footage." I didn't respond. I just stared at the treadmill blocking my bookshelf, at the pile of Rachel's boutique shopping bags on my reading chair. I thought about Harold's chair, collecting dust beside the leaf blower. I thought about how easily I'd let it all happen, but still, I didn't act. Not yet. Because when you've spent your entire life being needed, it's hard to admit that what they need from you now is not your love, but your silence. And my silence, it turned out, was the most valuable currency of all. It was a Tuesday morning when Rachel bounded into the kitchen, her eyes sparkling in a way I hadn't seen in years. She was dressed in a crisp linen blouse and white jeans, her hair curled just so, as if she were preparing for something far more special than the usual brunch with the moms from the school PTA. "Big news," she chirped, clutching Scott's hand like they were prom dates. "Scott's company is sending us to the Bahamas. All expenses paid. 1 whole week." She made a grand gesture toward the ceiling as if to summon confetti from above. Scott added with a grin, "They're rewarding top-performing teams. It's like a second honeymoon, and honestly, we deserve it." Rachel turned to me, softening her voice. "We wouldn't go if we didn't know the kids would be in the best hands. You're the reason we can take this trip, Mom." And just like that, she placed the ribboned burden of gratitude on my shoulders. I smiled. Because what else does a mother do when her daughter looks so happy? "It'll be good for you both," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "Go enjoy yourselves." I convinced myself it was true. They worked hard. Parenting 2 children wasn't easy, even with me in the background doing 90% of the work. They deserved a break, and I could handle the bedtime stories and juice spills for a week. Ben and Lily were my joy. That night, Rachel dropped a thick folder labeled "Emergency Contacts" on my coffee table. "Just in case," she said with a wink, her tone breezy and generous. "There's a gift card for pizza, the pediatrician's number, and our flight itinerary. We'll call every night." They left the next morning in a flurry of rolling luggage and oversized sunglasses. Lily cried at the door. Ben gave me a sticky kiss. Then they were gone. For the first 2 days, the house was quiet in a way that felt restorative. I read, cleaned, and napped with the windows open, letting the spring air drift in with the birdsong. Their nightly phone calls were short and filled with the sounds of crashing waves and clinking glasses. "We're being spoiled," Rachel said one evening. "It's like a dream." And for a brief moment, I believed her. Until the envelope arrived. I was sorting the mail by the garage catalogs, bills, a coupon for carpet cleaning when I saw it. A thick white envelope from the credit card company addressed to me. I almost tossed it aside. I rarely used the card myself, and Rachel had said she hadn't needed it in months. But something in my stomach tightened. I opened it on the kitchen counter, my fingers trembling ever so slightly. There, buried between line items for gas stations and department stores, was a charge from Sunrise Resorts Villas, $7,826, dated 2 weeks before they left. I stared at the number, my eyes tracing it over and over like a child learning to read. It didn't make sense. They said it was paid for by Scott's company. Why would a company reward trip end up on my personal credit card? I checked the vendor name again. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't misunderstood. My daughter and her husband had paid for their reward trip using my emergency credit card, the one she swore she'd only use for school supplies and last-minute dental copays. My chest went cold. I sat down at the breakfast nook, the paper rattling in my hands. My mind reeled, trying to fit the pieces together into something less cruel, something less obvious than what it was. Maybe it was a mistake, a hold, a miscommunication. I opened the emergency contact folder again and began flipping through the pages. Insurance, pediatricians, pizza coupons, and then something slipped out. A slim printed itinerary with the words, "Welcome to Sunrise Resorts" at the top, followed by a list of spa appointments, a cabana rental, and 2 seats for a champagne cruise. Tucked neatly into the folds of a meditation guidebook Rachel had left behind on the coffee table. A little ironic, considering. It wasn't a mistake, it was a lie. A glossy, curated, Instagram-ready lie that used my trust as currency. I pressed the edge of the itinerary between my fingers, the weight of it far heavier than the paper it was printed on. They hadn't just taken money, they had looked me in the eye, thanked me for watching their children, kissed my cheek with those empty words of appreciation, and boarded a plane to paradise, knowing full well I was footing the bill. I sat in silence, not crying, not shaking, just stunned. A long time ago, Harold used to say, "The worst kind of theft is the one wrapped in a smile." I hadn't thought about that in years. That night, after the kids were asleep, I poured myself a cup of chamomile tea and stared at the credit card statement. On the back was a reminder of how to report unauthorized charges. I didn't dial. Not yet. This wasn't unauthorized, not legally. I had handed over that card willingly. It was my name on the account. My responsibility. I let the paper fall to the table. They hadn't just used me. They had counted on me being too trusting, too small, too soft to notice. And they were almost right. It had been exactly 4 days since Rachel and Scott returned from the Bahamas, skin sun-kissed and spirits glowing, as if guilt couldn't cling to people once they'd bathed in enough ocean salt and luxury linen. They brought me back a t-shirt that read, "My mom stayed home while I was in paradise." I managed a smile, folded it neatly, and tucked it into the back of my drawer. I never wore it. We didn't speak of the credit card. They didn't know I had seen it. That I had held it in shaking hands, traced the charge with my finger like it was a wound, and I didn't tell them. Sometimes silence is sharper than confrontation. The days following their return were oddly sweet. Rachel lingered longer in the kitchen, offering me smoothies I didn't ask for. Scott gave me updates on the kids' school, as if we hadn't fallen into this rhythm long before he learned to pronounce Montessori. And then, one rainy Tuesday afternoon, Rachel knocked on the door to my suite. She held a leather-bound folder in one hand and 2 mugs of chamomile tea in the other. "Hi, Mom," she said, her voice unusually soft. "Do you have a minute?" I gestured to the couch. She sat beside me, setting the tea down gently on the coffee table, then opened the folder like it was a gift she had been dying to give me. "I've been thinking," she began, brushing imaginary lint from her leggings. "You've done so much for us, for the kids. And I want to make sure you're protected too." There was that word again. Protected. She slid the folder closer to me. Inside, a neat stack of documents stared up with clinical finality. I didn't need a second glance to recognize the formatting, the cold layout of legal language. It was a power of attorney, general, durable, immediate. "Just in case," she said, that same practiced warmth stretching across her face. "It doesn't mean anything changes right now. It's just a safety net. God forbid something happens, we'll be able to step in and help. No court delays, no confusion." Her words were smooth, memorized, like she'd rehearsed them in the mirror. I didn't touch the papers. Instead, I reached for the tea, letting the warmth seep into my palms, grounding myself. She kept talking. We've been reading about how important it is for families to plan ahead. You know, so no one gets overwhelmed. This would just give us peace of mind. Peace of mind. For whom, I wondered. A memory surfaced like a whisper from the past. It was a dinner party years ago, back when Harold was still alive. His colleague, Ms. Chandler, a sharp-witted estate attorney with silver curls and a voice that could slice through marble, had leaned across the table and said to me, "Evelyn, take it from someone who's cleaned up more than her fair share of family messes, never sign anything without a witness you trust." At the time, I laughed. Back then, I trusted everyone who shared my last name. Now I knew better. Rachel must have mistaken my silence for confusion because she gave my arm a gentle squeeze. "There's no rush. Look it over when you feel up to it." She set the folder on the coffee table with a satisfying little pat and took a sip of her tea. "Can I get you anything else?" she asked. "You look a little pale." Before I could answer, her phone buzzed. She pulled it from her pocket, glanced at the screen, and smiled. "It's just Scott," she said, tapping the screen. "I'll call him right back." But in her haste to impress, her finger missed the red end call button. She didn't hang up. And then, in a mistake so small it could have been brushed off with a laugh, she placed the phone down screen side up, unlocked and active on the table beside the folder. I sat there, pretending to sip the tea, while she stood to busy herself in my kitchenette, opening drawers, fiddling with a tin of peppermint tea she knew I didn't drink. And then it came. Scott's voice, piped in soft and tinny through the speaker, sliced through the quiet like a blade. "So, did she buy the for your protection garbage?" Rachel froze mid-reach, then hissed back, her voice low but clear enough to carry from both the phone and across the room. "Shh. Not now, but yes, I think so. She's doing that whole, let me read it over thing. Like the little schoolmarm she still thinks she is." She laughed, a dry, humorless sound that made my skin crawl. She has no idea what Harold's portfolio is actually worth. I saw a statement last year by accident. It's massive. Life-changing massive. There was a pause. My hands stayed perfectly still around the mug. My face didn't flinch, but inside, everything fractured. Harold's name, used like that, as leverage, as loot. Scott spoke again, this time with a smirk in his tone I could hear even from the speakerphone. "Just get her to sign it, Jess. Once we have the POA, Peterson can liquidate the rest. We'll sell the house, grab the condo in Siesta Key, and finally get her into Whispering Pines." A beat of silence. Then, as if the words themselves hadn't already buried me, Rachel replied, "I already looked into it. Whispering Pines is affordable. It's decent. Affordable." That word hit me harder than anything else. They weren't just planning for a rainy day. They were budgeting my erasure, spreadsheeting my final years, making space for themselves by sweeping me into some beige-walled facility with communal meals and windowless rec rooms. I had become a line item in their dream life. Rachel turned then, carrying a fresh cup of tea, her smile polished and bright. "Here you go, Mom," she said, setting the porcelain gently beside the folder. "You'll feel better after this." I looked at her. Really looked. For the first time, without the haze of motherly love, without the layers of guilt and history and hope. I saw the avarice around her mouth, the flicker of calculation behind her lashes. She thought I hadn't heard. She thought I was still the old woman she could pat on the head and shepherd into compliance. She didn't know I had just heard the verdict, and she had no idea I wasn't the defendant anymore. I was the judge. Rachel's voice floated above the clink of porcelain as she set the second cup of tea down in front of me, her tone sticky sweet like overripe fruit. "Drink this, Mom," she said. "You'll feel better." I didn't move. Not because I was paralyzed by fear, but because in that moment, I understood something that rewired me down to the bone. I had just overheard my daughter plotting my quiet removal from the story of her life. The tea sat untouched, steam curling lazily into the space between us. Rachel mistook my silence for confusion. She tilted her head, smiled like I was a child in need of coaxing. I nodded faintly, the way one does when they're not yet ready to show their cards. She stood, smoothed her leggings, and gathered the folder of legal documents, the ones meant to hand over the keys to my life. As she slipped her phone into her pocket, still blissfully unaware that it had just detonated 1,000 hidden truths, she gave my shoulder a final squeeze and left my suite with the slow, practiced grace of someone who thinks they've already won. The door closed with a soft click behind her. Silence bloomed. But it wasn't the silence of peace. It was the silence of a battlefield seconds before the cannon fire. I didn't cry. Instead, I sat perfectly still, the cooling tea forgotten, and let the reality settle around me like dust in a long, abandoned room. I stared at the space where Rachel had just stood and didn't see my daughter. I saw the ghost of a girl I used to be, the version of myself who believed that unconditional love would be enough, that raising a child well meant they would never betray you, that if you gave them everything, they would protect you in return. But that girl was long gone. I stood slowly, my joints stiff from stillness. My eyes drifted to the far side of the room, to the small side table beneath the window. There, in its silver frame, was a photograph I hadn't really looked at in years. Our family. Rachel at 12, gap-toothed and radiant, her arm slung around my shoulder. Harold behind us, smiling like the man who thought he'd built something solid and enduring. I had cleaned that frame more times than I could count. It always sat facing outward until now. Sometime in the last few days, someone had turned it down. The face of our family, hidden. I walked over and gently righted it. My fingers lingered on the edge of the glass. The photo, once a symbol of pride, now looked like evidence, a cautionary tale. I saw now what I hadn't wanted to admit, that somewhere along the line, Rachel had stopped seeing me as a person. I had become infrastructure convenient, replaceable. My sacrifices had been the bricks she used to build the illusion of her perfect life. And now that structure was no longer enough. She needed the deed, the portfolio, the control. She needed to erase me to preserve her fantasy. I had taught her to tie her shoes, to stand up to bullies, to say thank you and please. I had stayed up late helping her with science fair posters and washed her ballet tights by hand. I had clapped the loudest at every recital, driven her to every college tour, made hot cocoa after every heartbreak. And now she was plotting to move me into a place called Whispering Pines, like I was a piece of outdated furniture she didn't have the heart to throw out. Affordable, she'd called it. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding. It didn't shake. It didn't quiver. It was steady. It was the breath of someone who had spent a lifetime believing in the best in others and had finally learned how to stop. That night, I didn't sleep. I didn't even lie down. Instead, I moved slowly through my little suite, touching things. Not out of nostalgia, but with purpose. I laid out the financial documents Harold and I had kept locked away since the early 2000s. I opened the fireproof box and stared at the deed. My name, my house. I was not powerless. They had underestimated the wrong woman, but I would not confront them. Not yet. The woman they thought they could manipulate was useful, predictable, harmless. Let them believe she was still here. Let them hold on to that illusion for just a little longer. The next morning, I prepared breakfast like always. Pancakes, blueberries, fresh juice. I packed the kids' lunches with notes tucked inside. I smiled when Rachel walked into the kitchen, thanked her when she handed me a cup of coffee. I listened to her tell me about her Pilates class and nodded when she said she was thinking of redoing the living room for a more coastal vibe. I played my part to perfection, but inside, something had changed. I wasn't their foundation anymore. I was their reckoning. And while Rachel scrolled through Pinterest photos of beach homes and Whispering Pines brochures nestled in the trash where she thought I wouldn't look, I began building something of my own. Not revenge, but restoration. Not for them, for me. There's a kind of clarity that comes after devastation. Not the frantic, sharp-edged energy of panic, but something colder, steadier, A mental stillness that lets you finally hear the quiet voice inside you whispering, "It's time." I waited until the house was empty. Rachel had gone to her yoga class, Scott was at work, and the kids were safely tucked away at school. I moved carefully, deliberately, my steps silent against the hardwood floors as I made my way back into my suite. It was still there, tucked into the far corner of the closet beneath a stack of Harold's old cardigans and a crocheted blanket my mother had made before her mind began to slip. A black, fireproof lockbox, heavier than it looked, its surface slightly scratched, the clasp stiff with time. I placed it on the table, sat down, and opened it. The smell of old paper hit me first faint, dry, familiar. Like the archives at the high school where I'd spent most of my life, filing transcripts and verifying graduation dates. The tools of my old world, where order and documentation ruled, and now those same instincts returned like muscle memory. Inside the box were the artifacts of a life carefully built: Harold's pension information, stock certificates, bank account ledgers, the deed to the house with my name on it in bold, legal font. The original trust documents he'd created before his cancer diagnosis, the handwritten notes he'd scribbled in the margins like love letters to our future. We hadn't touched much of it since he passed, but I had kept it, untouched, like a mausoleum for the security we once shared. I spread the papers out across my desk, organizing them into piles: household, investments, property, and a separate pile I labeled, in my neatest handwriting, protective action. Then I reached for my leather-bound journal, the one Rachel once rolled her eyes at, calling it my paper therapy. I opened to a fresh page and wrote, carefully, deliberately, "Vengeance will be served with ink, not anger." It wasn't fury that moved me now, it was resolve. I picked up the phone and called Margot. She answered on the second ring. "Evelyn, everything okay?" "I need you," I said simply. Not emotionally, strategically. There was a pause. Then her tone changed, sharpened. "Talk." I told her everything, not just the credit card, not just the overheard phone call. I laid it out like a deposition, my voice calm, clinical. Margot didn't interrupt. When I finished, she exhaled long and slow. "That smug little..." She caught herself. "Okay, here's what you're going to do. First, you don't say a single word to them, not even a hint that you know. Let them think they're still in control. Second, call Lawrence today. Mr. Lawrence, Harold's old financial advisor. A man who still signed Christmas cards in fountain pen and referred to voicemail as that infernal contraption. I found his card tucked into the side pocket of the lockbox, yellowed, but legible. I dialed. "Lawrence Financial Group, this is Patricia," came the familiar receptionist's voice. "This is Evelyn Cooper. I need to speak with Mr. Lawrence. It's urgent." 10 minutes later, his voice came on the line, warm, steady, just as I remembered it. "Evelyn," he said, "it's been too long." "I need to make some changes," I said, quietly. There was no hesitation. "Of course. Come in tomorrow at 10. Bring everything." The next morning, I dressed the way I used to for work: slacks, blouse, low heels. Not for them, for me. To remember who I was before I was folded into someone else's margins. I arrived at Lawrence's office with 2 folders and a flash drive. We reviewed every account, every policy, every asset I still held. The portfolio had grown since Harold passed more than I realized. Rachel had seen only the surface. She had no idea of the depth beneath. "I want to create a trust," I told him. "Irrevocable, untouchable. For Ben and Lily only. No access for Rachel or Scott. I want every clause airtight. Education only. Released in stages after age 21. Administered by a third party, not family. No loopholes." He leaned back in his chair and smiled, not patronizing, but approving. "You've done your homework." "I was a registrar for 32 years, I said. "I know how to guard a paper trail." We named it the Evelyn Cooper Legacy Trust. It felt right. A tribute not only to Harold, but to the integrity he lived by. A legacy meant to nourish, not enable. To heal, not exploit. By the end of the meeting, my bank accounts were restructured. A new secure account was opened under my sole authority at a separate institution. The old credit card, the one Rachel had abused, was canceled. I instructed Patricia to mail the closure notice directly to my suite, not the main house. The final document I signed that morning was a directive revoking all prior financial authorizations, including Rachel's. It was legal, it was binding, and it was mine. On my way out, Mr. Lawrence placed his hand gently on mine. "You've done the hard part," he said. "Now let us protect what's yours." I nodded, feeling for the first time in years not vulnerable, but armed. I drove home slowly, savoring the spring air through the window. Birds danced along the roadside. Tulips were beginning to bloom in the yards I passed. It felt like the first morning of something I hadn't dared to name. I parked in front of the house and sat there for a moment, looking at the home I had paid for, built for them with Harold's memory folded into every beam and shingle. I wasn't sure how long I'd remain here, but one thing was certain: it would never belong to Rachel again. There was no declaration, no slammed doors, no shouting match in the middle of the kitchen while the neighbors peeked through the blinds. No, that wasn't my way. The day I started taking my life back was silent and exact. The first domino fell on a Thursday. Rachel burst into my suite without knocking, something she'd stopped doing back when she still pretended to respect my space, and waved a letter in her manicured hand like it had personally insulted her. "They canceled my card," she huffed, eyes wide with theatrical disbelief. "The salon wouldn't take it this morning. They said the account's been closed." "What happened?" I looked up from my crossword puzzle, reached for my tea, and took a slow sip before answering. "Oh," I said mildly. "That was the supplementary card I opened for emergencies, remember? My new advisor said it was a security risk to keep unused accounts open, so I had it terminated." Her mouth opened and closed twice before she found the nerve to sputter. "But I used that card." I raised an eyebrow. "Yes, I recall. Your last emergency was a week in the Bahamas." Her cheeks flushed. She opened her mouth again, but no words came. I returned to my crossword. That was the beginning. The next cut came quietly, via paperless statement. The kids' tennis lessons, which had always been billed directly to me out of convenience, arrived in the mail again. This time, with a red past due stamp. Scott appeared in the hallway, holding the envelope like a dead bird. "Carol, did you see this?" "It's late." I took the letter from him, examined it as if seeing it for the first time. "Yes, I saw it," I said. "It's addressed to you and Rachel." He blinked. "Well, yeah, but you always—" "I've been reevaluating my budget," I interrupted, tone calm but immovable. "My advisor has placed me on a stricter retirement plan. I'm afraid non-essential expenses for others just aren't part of it anymore." He stared at me for a long second. Then, silently, turned and walked back down the hall. That same week, Rachel approached me with her annual gourmet club dinner menu in hand. "Mom," she began in her sugary ask tone, "you know I'm hosting next week. I was thinking of doing a beef Wellington with truffle mashed potatoes. Oh, and a Bordeaux I found on sale at Total Wine. I didn't look up from the newspaper." "That sounds lovely," I said. She waited. "I hope your guests enjoy it," I added. A long pause. Then, her voice rising ever so slightly, "Well, I can't afford the ingredients on my own. You know this is important for the kids' social connections, for our standing in the community." I finally lowered the paper and met her eyes. "Then perhaps you should choose a menu that fits within your budget, dear. Pasta is very versatile." She left without another word. That night, I posted a small sign on the door to my suite, printed neatly on cardstock. "This is a private living space. Please do not store fitness equipment or other items in this area. Thank you." The next morning, the yoga ball and resistance bands that had made their way into my reading nook were gone. Not a word was said. I began setting firmer boundaries, all without confrontation. When Lily brought in another stack of Rachel's boutique shopping bags for me to organize, I gently redirected her to the hall closet. When Scott left a utility bill on my kitchen counter, I placed it back on his kitchen island. The changes were surgical, precise, but it was working. The air in the house changed. The tension, once hidden under Rachel's syrupy tone and Scott's performative politeness, began to thicken. Their conversations behind closed doors became shorter, tighter. I heard them whisper at night, pacing in their room, their footsteps no longer rhythmic but sharp. Rachel slammed drawers now. Scott lingered longer at the office, but none of that rattled me, because something inside me had settled, solidified. And then one afternoon, while sorting through a stack of coloring pages Lily had left on my couch, I found it. A paper heart, cut clumsily with blunt scissors, edges ragged and uneven. In crayon, Ben had written, "To Grandma, you are love." It wasn't fancy. There were fingerprints in glue, and one corner had been chewed by the dog, but I held it like it was glass. For a long time, I just stared at it. Then, without a word, I folded it once carefully, gently, and placed it inside the back of my journal, not as proof of Rachel's parenting, but as a reminder of what mattered, of what didn't, of where real love lives. It wasn't in the tennis lessons or the wine lists or the vacations. It wasn't in the whispered promises or the rehearsed gratitude. It was in sticky fingers and misspelled crayon notes. It was in the silent spaces where sincerity lived, unpolished and pure. I had spent so many years trying to earn love by being useful. Now, I was learning to recognize love that asked for nothing. That night, as I made a cup of tea and watched the light outside shift to amber, I thought of Harold. I could almost hear him low and steady saying, "Evelyn, when the wind changes, adjust the sails." The wind had changed, and my hands were finally on the ropes. It was raining the afternoon I found it, the kind of soft, steady rain that makes everything look like it's under glass. I was taking out the recycling from the kitchen, something Rachel had declared too messy for the kids to touch. And though I was no longer their unpaid maid, old habits sometimes served me. That afternoon, they did more than serve me. They revealed everything. As I pulled the trash bin from under the sink, a thin envelope slid off the top, not torn or crumpled, but folded once and tucked between glossy store coupons and an empty granola box. I wouldn't have noticed it, but something about the weight of its stiff paper, thick seal, made me pause. I plucked it from the mess and turned it over. The return address was printed in delicate green font. Whispering Pines Long-Term Care Community. The logo was a pine cone, stylized to look almost regal. Beneath it, a tagline, "Where life begins anew." I stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a brochure and a letter addressed not to me, but to Rachel. It thanked her for touring the facility, praised her proactive approach to senior care, and outlined 3 room options. The prices were circled in red pen. Handwritten in the margin, in Scott's unmistakable sharp print, were calculations. Costs, time estimates, projected proceeds from the sale of the house. Projected proceeds. I was a ledger line, a dollar amount, a subtraction. I stood in the kitchen for a full minute, unmoving. I could hear the low hum of the refrigerator, the rain tapping against the windows, the ticking of the old clock above the pantry. The house I had helped pay for, the house I had scrubbed, tended, protected. The house they planned to sell once they moved me out of it. The envelope slid from my hands onto the counter. I heard myself whisper, "They didn't plan to erase me. They already had." I don't remember walking back to my suite, but I do remember sitting at my desk, staring out at the rain-soaked garden, and feeling something harden in me. And not bitterness, not rage, something older, deeper, like stone being formed under pressure. I pulled out my address book. I hadn't called her in years, not since Harold's funeral, but her name had never left the first page, Miss Beatrice Chandler-esque. She had always signed her notes with a fountain pen and a touch of lavender perfume. Harold had trusted her, and so had I. She picked up on the 3rd ring. "Evelyn Cooper," she said warmly. Now, this is a voice I didn't expect to hear. "What's the occasion?" I took a breath. "I need to sell a house, Bea," quietly, "and I need to protect what's mine." There was a pause, then, "I'll clear my calendar." 2 days later, she arrived. Same leather briefcase, same crisp navy suit. a little grayer around the temples, but with eyes just as clear and direct as I remembered. We sat at my small table, the fireproof box between us, and I showed her everything. When I finished, she didn't gasp or blink. She simply nodded once, slowly, and said, "They think they've outmaneuvered you." "I let them think that," I replied. B smiled wide and wicked in the way only old friends can get away with. "Then let's show them how wrong they are." The next few days were a flurry of signatures, calls, and arrangements. She drew up the listing agreement for the house, but under a trust alias to avoid tipping off Rachel or Scott. We discussed options for a new place, small, private, mine. "We'll need to move fast," B warned. "Once escrow opens, they'll notice something's changed." "I'm counting on it," I said. Every night after that, I returned to my suite and watched them move around the kitchen like actors in a show they thought I was too old to understand. Rachel cooed about her spring garden plans. Scott dropped hints about wanting to renovate the master bath once things settled down. They still believed I would sign the power of attorney. They still believed I was theirs to move. I began packing. Not openly, just a drawer here, a jewelry box there. Photographs first, keepsakes, Harold's cufflinks, my mother's rosary, the book Ben had once asked me to read every single night for a year. I packed them gently, as if wrapping the parts of myself I had nearly let them discard. I placed the envelope from Whispering Pines on top of the stack in my filing drawer. Not as evidence, but as remembrance. A reminder of what it feels like when someone sees you not as family, not as history, but as liability. That night, as I folded my clothes into a suitcase I hadn't used since Harold's last birthday trip to Cape May, I found a small slip of paper on the floor. A list Rachel's handwriting. It had fallen out of her purse the day before. She hadn't noticed. I picked it up, read it slowly. House, Sell Mom, WP, Funds, Trust for Lily Ben, Admin by Scott, Rachel access via POA, target date, May 2nd. A plan, an actual itemized bulleted plan. And there it was in writing. My daughter had put me into an itinerary, a phase, a step on her way to something shinier. She didn't see me anymore. She saw what remained of me, but what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was that this time I was the one making the plan. My pen, my name, my timeline. Whispering Pines would not be my chapter. This was just the preface of my return. The morning the sign went up, the sky was an unapologetic blue. No clouds, no wind, just a crisp spring morning that smelled faintly of cut grass and new beginnings. I had asked the realtor to arrive early before the neighborhood walkers made their rounds, before Rachel could finish her coffee, before Scott could check his morning emails. At 7:38 a.m., a small silver Honda pulled into the driveway. A young woman in a navy blazer stepped out, nodded at me respectfully, and carried the for sale sign across the yard like it was any other day, any other house. But it wasn't just any house. And it was not just any sign, it was a declaration. She pushed the metal stakes deep into the ground firm, certain. The white board gleamed in the sunlight. My name was nowhere on it. No need. I knew. And soon, they would too. Rachel saw it first. I was standing at the window of my suite, folding the last of my linens into a moving box, when I heard her sharp intake of breath from the front door. "What? What is that?" Then the voice rose. "Mom!" She stormed into my suite without knocking, a final echo of the entitlement I had let go of weeks ago. Her face was flushed, mascara already smudging under one eye. Behind her, Scott appeared, still barefoot, holding his phone and squinting at the lawn like it couldn't be real. "Are you selling the house?" Rachel gasped, voice cracking between disbelief and rising fury. "Without telling us?" I turned slowly, folded the sheet in my hands one last time, and placed it neatly into the box. Then I walked over to the desk drawer, retrieved the file folder B had prepared, and handed it to them without a word. Scott opened it. Deed, title, authorization of sale, all under my name. He stared at the page, blinking, his lips moving as if reading could somehow change the meaning. This house belongs to me, I said evenly. Always has. Rachel looked like a child caught stealing from the cookie jar. No, worse, like a child discovering the jar was never hers to begin with. But you promised, she whispered. No, I corrected her gently. You assumed. She staggered backward a step, eyes filling. You're punishing us? For what? For needing help? For having a family? I studied her the way a teacher studies a failing student who refuses to show their work. You didn't ask for help, Rachel. You demanded it, expected it. Then you planned to erase me with a brochure and a spreadsheet. She sat down suddenly on the armrest of the couch, stunned. Scott was still flipping through the documents, as if one of them might reveal this was all a prank. This is so dramatic, Evelyn, he muttered. What will the neighbors think? I almost laughed. Even now, I thought. Even now, it's about appearance. I walked to the doorway and stood under the wooden beam Harold once sanded by hand. You built your kingdom on my silence, I said softly, but clearly. Now that silence is over. Rachel finally snapped. So, you'll just walk away from your grandchildren? From us? You'd do this to your own family? I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I pulled another folder from the desk drawer, the Evelyn Cooper Legacy Trust papers. I handed them to her too. I just signed their college fund, I said. Fully funded, tax protected, untouchable. Lily and Ben will never have to rely on anyone else's goodwill to become who they want to be. Rachel opened the folder with trembling fingers. Her eyes flicked over the numbers, the clauses, the name of the trustee Margot, not her. But you, her voice cracked again. You didn't even tell me. No, I said quietly. Because you're no longer part of my financial life. That's the cost of trying to erase someone. You don't get to mourn what you tried to bury. She slumped forward, as if some thread holding her upright had snapped. I did this for us, she whispered. I shook my head. No, you did this for control, for image. You tried to fold me into your narrative, just another footnote in the perfect suburban story. But I am not your footnote. Scott finally spoke, dry and bitter. You're leaving us with nothing. I turned toward him and said, No, I'm leaving you with exactly what you planned for me, freedom. They didn't follow me back to the suite. They just stood there in the living room, surrounded by framed family portraits that now looked like courtroom exhibits. I closed the door behind me, not with a slam, but a finality as soft as breath. Later that afternoon, I packed the paper heart Ben had made and placed it gently between the pages of my journal. I wrote under it, Love doesn't come from inheritance. It comes from intention. The lawn sign stood firm through the wind that evening. And inside the house, two people finally learned what it feels like to lose what they never truly valued. The sea is different in Charleston. It doesn't roar like it did up north. It hums a soft rhythm that slips in through the window screens and settles into your bones like memory. I wake to it now. Not to the clang of dishes I didn't dirty, or the sharp tap of Rachel's impatient heels down the hallway. Here, I wake to bird song and salt air, and silence. The good kind, the kind you earn. My new home isn't grand. It's tucked behind a row of pastel townhouses with iron balconies and ivy-covered brick. There's a courtyard in the back where lavender grows wild. The kitchen is just big enough for one person who cooks for joy, not obligation. And the front room? That's my library now. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, every shelf labeled in my own careful handwriting. Fiction by the window, memoir by the fireplace. Cookbook still sticky with Harold's old notes in the corner near the kettle. There's no guest room here. But there is a second bedroom, bathed in morning light, that smells of watercolor paper and turpentine. My easel stands by the window. A jar of brushes sits like a bouquet on the desk. For the first time in decades, I paint without interruption. No one tells me it's impractical. No one asks what I'm making or why. I paint because I want to. The children come on scheduled visits. Lily brings me seashells she collects near the pier, each one with a name and a story. Ben prefers my kitchen, where we bake molasses cookies and make up pirate names for each other. He calls me Captain Gran. I don't correct him. They stay weekends, sometimes longer in the summer. We read, we walk, we listen to jazz on the old radio Margot gifted me when I moved in. And when they leave, they always hug me twice, once for love, and once, just in case, as Lily says. Rachel never comes. Scott hasn't sent a word. I've stopped checking. The truth is, I no longer build doorways for people who tried to shut me out of my own house. I don't set extra places at the table. I don't wait for apologies from people who believe they've done nothing wrong. Margot comes often. We drink wine on the balcony and talk about how strange and beautiful it is to start again at 72. She says I've grown sharper, funnier. I tell her she's just not used to hearing me unfiltered. She laughs and says, "About damn time." The photo hangs above my writing desk. 4 figures on the beach, barefoot and windswept. Me, Margot, Lily, and Ben. We're holding hands, facing the horizon, backs to the camera. The light is soft, golden, the kind that makes you look like the best version of yourself, even when you're not trying. It's the first family photo I've taken in years. Rachel isn't in it. I didn't crop her out. She simply wasn't there. And that, I've come to realize, is the difference. There's no bitterness in that frame, only peace, intention. The people who showed up, the ones who held my hand not for what I could give, but for who I still was. Beside the photograph sits a book, my journal. The one I started the night I found the envelope from Whispering Pines. Its pages are soft now, worn at the corners. There are pressed flowers between the entries, sketches of teacups and city balconies, a small paper heart folded near the middle, and under it, in my own handwriting. Love isn't proven by blood or promises. It's measured by presence. I don't write in it as often these days. Life moves more slowly here. I don't need to document every injustice. I don't need to brace myself for betrayal. My pen, once a sword, is now just a tool again, something to steady my hand while I capture the slant of light on the bay or the shape of Ben's curious eyes when he asks, "Gran, were you always this cool?" I tell him no. I tell him I had to become it. Every morning, I sit on the balcony with my tea and the sound of gulls, and I think about all the things I used to carry. The fear of confrontation, the guilt of saying no, the need to be needed. I don't carry them anymore. What I carry now are paints, books, laughter, the voices of grandchildren reading aloud, the knowledge that I didn't just escape, I reclaimed. Harold once told me, on a warm spring evening not unlike this one, "Evelyn, you've always been the backbone. One day, I hope you see it." I didn't back then, but I do now. I didn't get my past back. I didn't rewrite the years spent shrinking to fit into someone else's life. But I rewrote the ending, and maybe that's the only chapter that's truly ours. I didn't get my past back, but I painted my future. If you've made it this far, thank you for sitting beside me through these pages of my life. This wasn't a story of revenge, it was a story of remembering who I am. Of learning that silence may keep the peace, but it can also bury you. And when you finally speak, really speak, the sound may be small, but it carries weight. We all have our own versions of this story. Maybe yours isn't about a house or a signature. Maybe it's about being overlooked, about giving too much and receiving too little, about forgetting your name while answering to someone else's expectations. But here's the truth. I learned the hard way. You are not too late. You are not invisible. And your story matters, no matter who tried to write it for you. So tell it. Speak it aloud. Whisper it to the wind. Write it in a journal. Paint it on a canvas. Or sit with someone you trust and simply say, "This happened, and I'm still here." And if this story touched something inside you, if it reminded you of your mother, your grandmother, or even yourself, please take a moment to like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe to Grandma's Final Chapter. We're building a place where women's voices, especially those long unheard, are finally given space to breathe. Because every chapter, no matter how quiet, deserves to be read. And the next one might just be yours.